This is the beginning of a new semester. It's the opening of a new era. It's the initiative of a new administration at SCI-Arc. And we're fortunate this evening to have Jan Perry with us.
Just get over here near the developers. Come on over.
We're fortunate to have assembled an unusual group of participants, actors, who are making the city and who will make the city of Los Angeles what it comes to be in the next few years. What's unusual about SCI-Arc, I think Mr. Gilmore, who I'll introduce in a second, I'm going to quote him, and if I'm misquoting him, the quote is worthwhile in any case, I think. Speaking about Jan Perry, who characterized the work that comes from SCI-Arc as extreme architecture. And I think SCI-Arc's history has been one very much involved with the making of pieces of cities, pieces of buildings, but the extreme characterization probably makes a certain amount of sense, or is at least plausible in terms of SCI-Arc's advocacy over a number of years. One of the topics that was important for the new administration of SCI-Arc in a new location, not in Santa Monica, not in the suburbs, not in the marina any longer, but in the center of downtown, or at least an essential or integral part of downtown, was to begin to involve ourselves in a discussion which is a different kind of discussion than the one that the previous 20 or 25 years had been focused on. And part of that transition, I think, has to do with language, discussion, tactics, and strategy, so that what we want to find ourselves in a position to do is to speak in a way, to contribute in a way to the discussion of the city, but in a way that others who are essential participants can understand what we advocate, and we can participate together in a discussion about the future of the city. So I think the point is less SCI-Arc as an introverted institution and more about SCI-Arc coming of age in a mature way and participating in a discussion about what the city will come to be. And of course, the moving of SCI-Arc into downtown facilitates that. This evening, we have on my extreme right,
but oddly on his left,
which certainly doesn't locate Mr. Gilmore politically, is Tom Gilmore, whose development work in the city I think most of you know, some of you indeed inhabit. On his left is Howe, who is raising his hand to correct me, who is the Director of City Planning of the City of Los Angeles. To his left is Dan Rosenfeld, who in partnership with Ira Yellen and others over the years is author or coming author of a number of remarkable projects, the MTA project, the old Herald Examiner building, and so on. And finally, to his left, Councilwoman Jan Perry, in whose domain we find ourselves. She's the councilwoman of this district, so she may be in a position to offer a level of insight that is crucial to the future of SCI-Arc. What I wanted to do tonight, briefly, is to give the panel and perhaps at some point the audience a chance to talk about several related, interconnected subjects, and we'll see how the discussion evolves. One is cities in general. The second is Los Angeles in general. And the third is Los Angeles in particular, which is to say SCI-Arc in particular. What I did, and I'll try to do this quickly, as an impetus or as an attempt to instigate at least a sense of some of the topics that will come up, I took a few slides, and if you can show these in pairs, Jack, you want to flip the lights down, and I'll put up a couple of slides and just make a few comments. Can you see, or is that? Can you turn that? It's difficult to talk about cities in the world now without some kind of reference to what went on at the end of Manhattan, both in terms of the event and in terms of potential solutions or strategies or points of view that either were or have become something else as a consequence of that. The slide on your left is cartoonish, but it suggests a kind of polemic, which I think in some discussions is forcing a framework on a subject which is much more complicated, but it's either Islamic fundamentalism at the top or mercantilism or the search for cool at the bottom. Next, please. The slide on your left, I dug out this morning, and it's particularly fascinating to me. It again has to do with remembrance or memory, or the erasing of a memory and the proposal to construct something else. Napoleon wanted to build this elephant, Punic references apparently, on the site of the Bastille, where the Bastille had been torn down. Apparently his objective was to make the citizenry forget about what happened at the Bastille and remember what he did. Next, please. On the left, Pershing Square. On the right, Frank Lloyd Wright in Tokyo, and the beginning of a discussion that has to do with Los Angeles as an ephemeral city, as a city where destinations change, where emphases change, where there isn't a stable conception or perception of what the city is, or a stable structure, whether that's so, whether that's good, and whether that will continue. Next, please. Two ideal cities, ideal in a conceptual sense, not necessarily in a literal sense. The one on the left is in Iran, the one on the right is in India. But interestingly enough, they are cities with centers. And the discussion, for some, an antiquated discussion, for some, a discussion which is coming, that has to do with the meaning with civic meaning and civic center, particularly in a city which, in terms of the San Fernando Valley, Hollywood, or San Pedro, seems to be pulling in a number of directions. And last, SCI-Arc itself, and the question I think we want to look at is what the presence of SCI-Arc at the eastern edge of downtown portends, what SCI-Arc's presence here means, and what SCI-Arc can initiate in terms of where the city might be headed. This is a suggestion of possibilities. There was one other thing that I wanted to do. There's a participant that would probably have been here but is no longer with us, Ira Yellen, who was, I think, instrumental in a number of ways in initiating discussions over the years that have led to the primacy or the focus or the emphasis or the particular concern with the city and the center of the city. And I thought I would ask Dan to say a word or two about Ira and what he had contributed to our view of the city.
Los Angeles is sometimes regarded as a city without a center, or even a city that's against having a center, but as most of you know, historically that wasn't true. Up until about 1940, downtown was the only commercial center of the city, and the streets around this building were among the busiest in the United States. But most of us in our lifetime remember a very different vision of the city. And Ira Yellen came here as a child, and it's interesting that he selected downtown for his major work because he was really a product of two very different, almost extra perfect environments here. As a teenager, he grew up in the San Fernando Valley in its heyday of American graffiti, classic cars, and new suburbs, and drive-through restaurants, and later in his life lived in Santa Monica Canyon on the west side, but ultimately came downtown probably one of the first of the current wave of people who committed to trying to restore, bring back, or reinvent what downtown will become, and what I think we'll talk about here today. I know that our work with the state of California and restoring the Broadway and Washington buildings would not have happened without Ira. I think Tom would say that his buildings would have been impossible without those before him. And in a sense, these begat the projects, whether it's Chris Hammond or Isaac Shomoff, CIM, Frank Gamwell, the others, including this building here, perhaps, are all in some degree the legacy of his work. He died a week ago. Today, and in the last email which he wrote, which was read at a service at his house over the weekend, he complained about the lack of urbanity in projects like the Grove and the Beverly Center. So to the day he died, he was still fighting this good fight. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me go back to the World Trade Center just to start, and I'd like to ask, maybe we can start this with Mr. Gilmore. Whether he could speculate for us on the consequence of that event to the city of Los Angeles, either in terms of it coming down or the prospects for its going back up in whatever form that turns out to be, and whether the priorities now, the sort of the business of America is business, or the business of America was business and is now.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I come from New York and went there the week that the World Trade Center went down, because it was so, enormous in so many ways to everybody, but to New Yorkers in particular. What effect did it have? I mean, I hate to admit it, being an Angelino now, but everything that happens in New York affects LA, and to think that it doesn't is simply, lying to ourselves that it's really all about the beach, and it's not. I think what's occurred because of the World Trade Center is that there is this bizarre discussion, which I love, and it's based on what to do now in that same exact spot. And I think if you talk to any New Yorker, when the World Trade Center went up, may it rest in peace, but God, everybody hated it. It was perhaps one of the most anti-urban pair of structures. In fact, there used to be a joke, the only thing that could be uglier than the World Trade Center is if there was only one of them. And that's true. That's what we used to joke about. We all loved the Empire State Building. We all loved the Chrysler Building. We hated the World Trade Center because it was so out of scale. It was so inhumane. It was so very much not a part of New York City. It was really only in the early 90s when it was, you know, first bombed in the basement that for some reason its strength, I literally remember coming in again the week right after that bombing because, you know, God forbid, you know, I wouldn't go. But I remember coming in and coming in from Kennedy Airport in a cab and looking at the World Trade Center and just seeing them stand there after they had been bombed. And I literally, as a New Yorker, just looked and said, kissed my ass. You know, this is what architecture is really about. Bomb it if you will, it's not going anywhere. And that's when New Yorkers really got involved with it, because all of a sudden the World Trade Center became a personal expression of what it was to be New York. And it then became ultimately a personal expression, as it is now, of what it was to be an American. And how bizarre that a piece of architecture can do that. And not, well, forgive me, not a very, very, very good piece of architecture, but look at the power it has. And I think that the discussion about what's going to happen there now is a fascinating discussion, because now all of a sudden we get to redesign it, and we get to look at New York and cities in a different way and say, all right, what's the real balance? What should the balance of cities be in terms of business, in terms of the street, in terms of the community around it? And now add, this issue of, and how do we remember those people who died there? But that's specific to the Trade Center. But the other issues, the non-memorial issues of the Trade Center, are the questions we're asking right now in LA. Because LA has been this great abandoned slate of architecture that has lain fallow for years and years and years, mixed with some relatively bland new architecture that went up on Bunker Hill over the course of the last 20 years. And we're asking these same series of questions right now, because all of a sudden there is this momentum, and we're not just building, we have to ask what's appropriate. What's more than what it is all by itself? What adds this sort of level of community and architecture and density and how the city works as a piece? So the World Trade Center really is just sort of a magnifying glass of the very same questions we have to be asking here, which is how do we make the pieces, whether it's one downtown or 19 different downtowns, in a city that is multi-nodal. How do we best express the needs of a city in those given nodes, and specifically in downtown? So it's a really important question. If
you go back to the discussion of what architects think, and I think initially what I was suggesting was that one of the things that SCI-Arc wants to do is to move a little bit outside of that discussion. It's too arcane, it's too self-serving, it's too narrow, we know, nobody else knows. But what's interesting is that the symbolism of the building has an entirely different meaning to Osama bin Laden and others. In other words, it stood for something in America, either a behavior pattern, a way of living, a value system, priorities. It had a meaning which was a very different meaning than the meaning it had for architects, then almost non sequitur. So to attack that, and I think this is part of what's intriguing about the discussion, is in someone's eyes to come at a subject which is at the heart of the meaning of America. And it seems to me that part of the problem now is to say, was that the meaning? I don't know whether that's true or not. And if it were the meaning, or if it was, what's the next meaning? Is the next meaning more of the same, or the next?
Yeah, and I think you can ask yourself if architects are in the process, when they design these things, are they aware of that subtext? Are they aware of what's the meaning of the building? Not the meaning of the building architecturally, but what's the meaning of the building in terms of its use to the broader community? I mean, that's, Dan's got that issue coming up with the Caltrans building. What does Caltrans mean? The Metropolitan Water District building in downtown, the MTA building in downtown. They all mean something to people, not always good things, and the architecture almost needs to be a modifier when you hit things like that.
Actually, you've hit on one of the few subjects I feel able to personally speak about, because for 12 years I lived right around the World Trade Center, and for 4 of those years I used it every day as kind of my local shopping street, because there were no other services. I mean, you got your shoes repaired, or you went to the bank or whatever at the base of the World Trade Center. And I have just a couple thoughts, and they actually relate back to downtown Los Angeles. First of all, it always was seen as 210-story towers that were completely divorced from everything. But there's this marvelous ability of humanity to humanize even something as impersonal as the World Trade Center. And so for me and all my neighbors, it kind of, the towers ceased to exist, and to us, the bottom, you know, which had, I think, like 400,000 square feet of commercial space, maybe it wasn't that much, but at any rate, it was like, you know, downtown. It was the shopping district for our nascent neighborhood. So there's this, it reminds me that despite what architects build, the human factor of how the place is used and how it's perceived has a whole nother dimension. And so, getting back to your point, different people saw it as different things. Some saw it as a symbol of corporate America. Others saw it as their local shopping street. Others saw it as, you know, the subway entrance. So it did have different meaning even to people right in New York. But the other thought I would say that gets back to what you were talking about, Tom, is what interests me about the discussion now of rebuilding the Trade Center on the site of it, and contrasting that dialogue with what goes on in Los Angeles when you talk about building in portions of downtown Los Angeles, is there's a series of constraints applied to the discussion of the World Trade Center. I know a lot of the people working on it, and they've already have their set of principles, which they want to reestablish the street grid. There's, I can bet you anything that the architecture of the buildings will be a certain historicist. There'll be probably, you know, on one end it'll be like Caesar Pelle's World Financial Center, or maybe at the other end there'll be takeoffs on the Woolworth building, or there'll just be this kind of historicist thing in a classic grid, and the memorial parks will be rather static, probably beautifully done squares, and that kind of, all those constraints, which maybe you could argue is appropriate given the context of Lower Manhattan, that kind of, those constraints aren't in place, it seems to me, in downtown Los Angeles. And to me, that's what's really exciting about the potential architectural future of downtown Los Angeles, is the absence of constraints and the absence of a consensus that, oh, you know, gee, it has to be that tall, or the street has to go this way, or whatever. And I think there's a lot more freedom and a lot more potential in, and I think you referred to it in an article as just plain anarchy. But out of that anarchy, I think you know, some very interesting things will happen in downtown Los Angeles. And while I certainly hope good things happen in the site of the World Trade Center, it's really a much more constrained environment.
I have to say that in a different context, I think I've argued that the site shouldn't be subdivided or zoned in that way, and that part of the obligation of the building is to deal with a number of subjects simultaneously, as opposed to sequestering the mercantile piece and putting the memorial piece somewhere else. I mean, how that would happen, we have to discuss. But the other point that you made about the perception of big buildings, and I think that was also an argument which has been around a long time, that big buildings have an external meaning over long distances. So this is not a matter of getting your shoes repaired or buying a sandwich, but that they're enormous objects which have colossal outsides and in some ways no insides. One, at least metaphorically, one could, that it's about the building at some scale. I know Dan is involved in the Caltrans project, and which isn't quite the same, but maybe you could comment a little bit on insides and no outsides, or outsides and no insides, or something.
Well, I think it is in some ways very much the same. It's our building, the Caltrans building, is for the Department of Transportation of the city and the state, and it's a building about mobility. And there's no topic that I think cuts more to the nature of what defines this city than mobility, whether it's physical mobility in a convertible driving under palm trees down Venice Boulevard, or social and economic mobility, which is what attracted most of us here. I think part of the problem with the World Trade Center was that in its arrogance, it became a target and a symbol that drew the wrong kind of attention to itself. My thought, just briefly on looking at the site, which like many of you I've visited in the last year, is that it's somewhat devoid right now of the fourth dimension of context. We tend to think of a building's context three-dimensionally, but the fourth dimension is time, and they know this in Europe and Asia better than we do. The land has had a purpose and a meaning even before people, but specifically to people over time. And there was a time when Wall Street had a wall, and Canal Street had a canal, and the Battery had guns, and there's quaint pictures of Dutch windmills. And when I think of what should be built on Lower Manhattan, I think it's narcissistic of our generation to assume that our catastrophe, as horrible as it was last year, is any worse than the draft riots of 1863 or the influenza epidemic of 1918, which killed far more people in New York City, and that somehow that there's more there in terms of the history, and that a building that fits in a little better with its time and place is less likely to be attacked by airplanes.
Would you care to contribute to that, or
Yeah,
should I go?
I look at that catastrophe as an opportunity to, I guess, do what Dan says, to restate history through a form, but to also draw people in and to make it more of a living force. And when I think about some of the feelings that I had about the World Trade Center, and I'm not from New York, so I didn't hate it, but I can understand how it was the grand symbol of the ultimate in capitalism and perception of prestige. I try to think about how that would apply to Los Angeles, and I guess I have a different take on that, which is when I think of Los Angeles and what makes us mobile and ties us together, to me it's water. And the history of water and how water was brought into this valley from other parts of California, and what I can do to create something that would embody those characteristics and tie the history together, and yet make it a force, a socio-economic force, an economic development force. And what I hope to do, and I shudder to say this because I know Tom will be out tomorrow with his broker buying up all the property, but to change the entitlements on either side of the LA River so that we can...
Which side first?
The side, not the railroad track side, but to create, I don't know if you want to call them micro societies or villages or entities, but to tie, the river would be the thing that ties us all together from the south all the way out to the San Fernando Valley, with expressions of housing and intermixing other experiences, natural and man-made as well.
I mean, it's an intriguing subject.
It's a block away.
I know.
It's right there.
I mean, if you look at a city like Seattle, where the relationship of the land to the water is really this kind of thing, as opposed to the city of Los Angeles, which is absolutely, its presence is contingent on the availability of water, but the visual availability of water. I mean, in Seattle, you see it, you feel it's part of the sensibility. It's certainly not part of the current Los Angeles sensibility. Depending on what happens with the river and various projects, it has been long ago, it could be again. But at the moment, I think when people think of water, you have to move to Santa Monica, or you got a long drive on a Sunday afternoon and the freeway's backed up to Centinela. So Los Angeles is not a city where the sensibility of water reflects the importance or the critical nature of water.
But it was, and it wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the river. The river valley, very briefly, was selected by the Spanish as being the most ideal place to form a settlement in all of California. There was year-round flowing water between the hills of Boyle Heights on the east and Bunker Hill on the west, and that's where the city was founded and where the city grew, and you can still see on a good day how that river valley might eventually be what it once was. I agree with Jan that there is no greater opportunity physically or socially for uniting this city than to redevelop the riverfront.
We have different technology, though, other than what history would indicate, because we have opportunities to take the concrete up. We have opportunities to dam parts of the river so that we don't have to fight other municipalities or other parts of the state to take water from them.
Well, it's I think not, or maybe I'm wrong, implausible to take the WLPA project away. I think the opportunity that is available to us is to use that as a kind of building site or as a piece of infrastructure, and another Los Angeles with a different meaning and a different density, which associates with something that existed previously, but inevitably would have a different meaning and a different form as a consequence of our starting point, which is a consequence of the fact that the WLPA euphemistically put it in. The next point that I'd like to raise has to do with a perception of the city of Los Angeles as a young city. There are often comparisons made. Los Angeles is this, and Venice is that, and Shanghai is the other thing, and Berlin is something else. But Los Angeles is a relatively new city. And in a very fundamental way, one could argue, I think, doesn't yet know its priorities or its emphases. And I can remember not so long ago a period where it was Westwood, or the next subject was Westwood in a certain context, or Melrose. Now Westwood is less a subject, Melrose Avenue has a meaning. And now it's downtown, and what the future might be for downtown. And the question is Los Angeles as an ephemeral paradigm, meaning a city which continues to shift its weight or its emphasis or its meaning over time as priorities change. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that the future of the city, or is that simply indicative of a condition of youth which ultimately solidifies, and there's the lake shore, and there's the Loop, and there's downtown, and there's Midtown, and there's the Ringstrasse, and there's the Rambla, and whatever it is, and Los Angeles just hasn't gotten to that point?
I think the answer is yes to all those questions. Yeah. I mean, I think it is good. I think it is bad. I think it is inevitable. Oddly enough, I mean, even though LA is sort of, other than the beaches, it really isn't about water now, and clearly it was once. But it was this very strange and wonderful torrent that we were always talking about. But it is, in its development, very tidal. That's what's starting to hit me now as we start to think about what we're going to do over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, you know, is what happened to LA, given what was going on in terms of technology, was absolutely inevitable. I mean, it wasn't formed like other cities. It wasn't formed for the purpose of commerce initially. It was formed, you know, people came here because they had done well somewhere else, and they were starting to form these little gentleman farms, and it didn't form, growth became its major industry for a long, long time. And then when the automobile came, it was inevitable that the love affair with the automobile in this city was going to be unlike any other city in the world, and it continues to this day. But it's tidal. It's already, I mean, it's pretty clear. There's been 1,000 discussions now that that it's reached the edge of this tide. We're not going to climb up the mountains anymore, where it's going to start doing what it does, and that is in these centers, whether it's downtown or Burbank or Glendale or Hollywood or Culver City or any of them. Each one of those will begin to pick up density. It has to. It's inevitable. If you have single-family and quasi-rural settings out here, the only way to preserve that ultimately is for those centers to begin to pick up the tide again and get a little more vertical, a little denser. Is it good? Yeah, it's great. Is it bad? Sure, it's awful. It really depends on how you address each and every one of those problems.
You could structure the density. I mean, if you anticipated that
that's the point.
In a certain way.
Yeah. You have to plan on the fact that it's going to happen. I think that's the insanity of LA for so many years was its position as the promised land was based on land. And guess what? It's over. It's not happening that way anymore. So now its position as the promised land is going to be this wonderful, I think, new hybrid that we and I really mean this, as we have an enormous amount to say about. I've never seen a city that's poised like this city is poised to be able to take the kind of input intellectually, artistically, and any other way you can imagine. I don't know another city that's poised like this city is to take in, the new Eden.
I also think that the complexity of it, where so many different things happen in the same landscape, makes it amazing. It's not an easily readable city like some of the ones you were mentioning. I mean, it's not a concentric circle. It's not clearly built along, a rail line or a river or whatever. And even your own comments about something happening here, something happening there, implies what does go on in the region, which is a lot of different things are going on at the same time. You can have a developing downtown. At the same time, you can have a developing beachfront or a developing Melrose or fill in the blank. And I think some of its oddities are the part that makes it so special. I think it's fabulous that I have an office in City Hall, as does Jan, and probably within 20 minutes of City Hall, you could be in a place where you could be attacked by a coyote or a mountain lion. And they aren't roaming the corridors of City Hall.
In the City Hall for that.
That's just on Los Angeles Street.
And there are not many.
Jan said that would be a snake.
And there are not many cities in the world like that. And yet, it's not like, this precious little contained dense city that then is surrounded by some huge green belt. It's this crazy pattern of density and no density, and I think it will evolve, as the way Tom mentioned. I mean, certain things will not happen. The mountains will not be built on further, and instead the growth of the city will be along certain corridors and in certain centers like downtown.
Would you be an advocate of structuring the growth along corridors?
I guess I wouldn't have a job if I didn't say I would be. But this is one of the few places you can admit that I think one of the problems with planners in general and planning in Los Angeles is that it wants to be too structured. It's like, everyone line up, all the manufacturing line up over here, all the residential line up over there, and there's kind of an anal quality to planning about it, wanting it to be very precise about where everything is.
Am I hearing that right?
Well, Los Angeles is, its history, a little bit of the Wild West was different, but I think what's happened over time, and it's been a good addition, is that it has gotten more structure. And yes, it is both the city's policy and sometimes our laws which structure that development. So yes, you can, and you're encouraged to build downtown. You're encouraged to build along certain corridors. You're not encouraged to build in the mountains. You're not encouraged to build in certain other places. And so, yeah, that's a structure, and I think it's going to keep evolving.
What Con is hinting at is the heart of what makes this city different. I'm sort of tired of hearing Los Angeles described as being a young city or a city that's poorly planned. I don't think we're young, we're not dumb. We're just different. The cities that Eric was mentioning, Vienna was a city, the part that we love, that was designed by and for a Habsburg emperor. Berlin was the playground of Frederick the Great and his successor, and other classic cities like Tokyo and Paris and others were designed by autocrats, for their own personal whims. And there's probably 2 or 3 of us in this room who would have the right combination of resources, upbringing, race, and religion to even think about having a design job in those cultures. And LA is very different. It's a popular vision. To me, it's about freedom and about opportunity. People come here in more numbers than come to any other city in the world looking for the same opportunity to express themselves, and we have to understand that if we're going to accommodate and exploit and develop that kind of creativity, we have to be less structured, I think more willing to accept a certain messiness and vitality in a positive way, and have less of the pretty landscaping you'll see in Portland, Oregon, or even in Santa Monica. The nature of this city is to be very individualistic, much less communal or communitarian. We can't solve our big problems, but we still produce the greatest creative talents in every field and anywhere in the history of the world. That's sort of our curse and our blessing.
I don't know if this quite follows from that, but the history of architecture in Los Angeles, SCI-Arc in particular, and a number of architects who work in this city and have taught here over the years, might be either a manifestation of that or symptomatic of that, depending on whether you believe that the city makes the architects or the architects make the city.
Well, I mean, to some extent, you've got the weird thing about LA and I'm not sure if it's bad or good, it just is what it is that to a very large extent, right up until today, or this current round in the last year or two, the architectural community seems oddly disengaged from the conversation about the urbanism in Los Angeles. Architecture, to a very large extent, has been the realm of individuals doing work on individual projects with no relationship to any other project. That'll go on and on and on for a long, long time, but then there is this new thing that's happening, and I think SCI-Arc is a perfect example of it, where the nexus between architectural theory and the reality of urban revitalization have hit head on in a really wonderful way, and now this extraordinary discussion is going to happen with 1,000 architects all sitting at the same table, and I don't think that discussion's happened before in Los Angeles, and I'm dying to see how it comes out, but it's going to be a little painful, I think, in the process too.
It's messy for sure. I think it's important for the audience to know that SCI-Arc is quite unique as an institution, and it's unique because it's not the academy insulated from the street corner, as we've said before, so that what SCI-Arc advocates as a position in cities, or in this city, or in the eastern part of downtown in this city, is likely what SCI-Arc will try to do, or find a way to do, or find a way to implement. So SCI-Arc's ability to exist and to survive is contingent on making the right assumptions, or the right suppositions, or the right analysis, meaning this is not the Kennedy Center that makes position papers. Mm-hmm. We take a position and we'll live the position, and I think we're in the process of trying to do that.
Could you discuss SCI-Arc's decision to move from the Playa Vista area to downtown?
Could I?
Yeah, because I've actually never heard anyone discuss that, and I think how much was it just simply a real estate issue, or how much was it a philosophical decision?
I'm the inheritor of that decision. I'm not the maker of that decision. I think SCI-Arc originated, as I said initially, much more in the terms that Mr. Gilmore was talking about, as an institution very concerned in an obsessive way, in an extreme way, to attempt to quote Jan. And I don't say this in a pejorative way. I think the art form of SCI-Arc and its advocacy of extreme architecture is there somehow. but it then went to the marina, which seemed to be even more distant from issues of the city. And I think the coming downtown gave SCI-Arc the opportunity, as I said initially, to go from introvert, and when I say introvert, I mean this internal discussion with architects. It's not an introverted discussion, it goes around the world, but it's very often architects talking to architects about subjects which are not always shared by the people who see it, inhabit it, ride by it, use it, and all of that. And I think, again, certainly with Tom's help, hopefully Jan's as well, I think what we want to do is to activate that extroversion, if we can, for the city, for the artist district, for the loft district, for west of SCI-Arc, and see what we can make down here, which suggests a position of integration with other elements in the city, not just object making, but doesn't shun the object making either. I think it's a complicated prospect, but I think this is very much what the next step of SCI-Arc hopefully will be about. Obviously, we need a hell of a lot of help to do that.
But so moving downtown gave you a chance to engage, or the opportunity to engage.
To grow a little bit, I think, to grow, to mature, and to stop looking only at the subject that we say is the subject, and to start listening to subjects and points of view that belong to other people who ultimately will have a hell of a lot more to say about the shape of the city than we will on all occasions. So if the operation is a partnership and a sharing and a real exchange, then I think we have a chance to do what we're looking to do. We're trying not to give it a form, an object form. We're trying to give it an objective in terms of a strategy, of a city strategy, and an anticipation of what the city might be, not just a reiteration of what it is.
You know, if you look at what's going on right now, just the two developers, between myself and Dan, Dan's doing mixed-use housing development on mass transit nodes up on the Pasadena line. We're doing mixed-use development down in the Old Bank District. Dan's doing the Herald Examiner building, taking an old, a wonderful old building down here and doing it as creative office space. We're taking St. Fabiana's Cathedral and turning it into a thing for. Who the hell am I doing it for? For Cal State LA. Yeah. It doesn't matter who we do it for. Dan is working on the Caltrans thing. They're just a client like anybody else. So there's a broad range of things that we're all taking a shot at here, and there's a lot more coming up. And I think one of the questions everybody has to ask themselves, and certainly we do every day at the table, is, yes, there is this sort of broad philosophy, and and whether people buy into it or not, the issue of revitalization of urban centers is a gimme. We're in it. It's not, the clock is not turning back. We're not going to rediscover new urbanism. We're not going to rediscover suburbanism. Urbanism and its new expressions are a given, and I think everybody needs to kind of get over that. Now we need to figure out how to do it properly. The huge questions that are coming up involve architecture, clearly, because we're dealing with historic architecture, and we're dealing with new architecture that's going to become lots of the infill architecture of this stuff. We're dealing with community in the sense that none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. So we've got to figure out exactly what our goals are philosophically, and then find out if we match up with the community, because guess what? If the community doesn't buy into it, it ain't happening. We have to deal with density issues in and of themselves, mass transit issues in and of itself that we haven't dealt with. We have to deal with issues of homelessness and what we're going to do in terms of vast quantities of people that exist in what used to be, and excuse the phrase, but the armpit of LA. The armpit of LA was downtown Los Angeles, you know. So now we have this great vision of the Emerald City coming up in downtown Los Angeles. Well, guess what? Somebody else is here. And we don't get, you know, we're not going to get to redo the Cowboys and Indians scenario. We don't just get to chase them out and put them on reservations. We have to figure out very, very complex things that go beyond simple architecture. It's not, we don't get away with the easy game of just architecture anymore. Architects don't, we don't as developers. Everybody's got to do something that's a little more complex and driving a new economy and a new architecture. And SCI-Arc is, oddly enough, and I don't want to make this a commercial for SCI-Arc, but man, we couldn't have picked a better time to be down here because we are in the hotbed of the new architecture of this millennium. It's absolutely true, and it's not just, you know, talk on my part. I can't tell you how lucky we are that you're here and how lucky you are that you're here.
Jen?
I'm
Did I go off? Did I digress?
Yeah, he was being very deep tonight. No, I'm glad that SCI-Arc's here too, because it's provided a whole new community for advocacy for and against projects that perhaps should or should not be built in the area. But and I appreciate that because it brings a new voice and a different perspective on things. But I also think that change is good. Because it gives us a chance to respond to the change in demographics and the change in social needs. I was standing with a developer on a former dairy site, which is south of the freeway, and will be made into a school. And it was contaminated, and it's been remediated. And so when I hear people say there's no land, I almost have to laugh because there's plenty of land. There's land that has many things on it that shouldn't have been there in the first place, like things that contaminated chrome factories, or motels that engage in prostitution, or swap meets, or activities that cut neighborhoods in half. And so when I look at an area, I stand in the south part of the district and look north, and I think, how can I bring people from the south to the north and vice versa, and to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities, you know, to be able to enjoy themselves, to have cultural opportunities, to be able to interact with people they wouldn't normally meet. How do you get them there? And what are the things that I need to create or to encourage so that we can create neighborhoods that feel unified again and that feel a neighborhood as opposed to being chopped in half. So those are the things that I look at. And I have one practical suggestion for SCI-Arc, because I would like to have this experience for SCI-Arc to figure out a way that it could compete for work through responding to requests for qualifications or requests for proposals, or to join design build teams so that you could actually not only articulate a vision, but as you say, produce or implement that vision. And I would like to look for ways to actually do that, and maybe Con could make some suggestions on that since he runs city planning, but it's something that I think we could actually take thoughts and transform them into vision.
That actually
How much do you really want to engage? Would you rather kind of sit back and critique?
I'm happy to do either one. It sounds encouraging. I would say that the definition of available land and buildable sites in the city might not have to be restricted to conventional definitions of property unbuilt. It could be rights of way, air rights, the river, the air rights over the railroad tracks, freeway systems, which are enormous. I mean, if you looked at a freeway system, which is essentially a one-dimensional kind of piece of infrastructure, I mean, there would have to be an enormous shift for people at this table to agree that that actually is a site and a high-density site. But it's not inconceivable that one could restructure the city again with a very different definition of what constitutes a buildable area. Not necessarily
Well, I have a strange example of that, are these abandoned MTA connector lines, and they run throughout South LA, starting in downtown. And, I've looked at them and I see the opportunity to create a connecting green space, a passive park, to correct what was done incorrectly in the past, was to chop right through a residential neighborhood and perhaps restore it and give people something that they didn't have before, which is recreational space. But, it's difficult to be able to put that all together. Not only do you have to deal with the money part and the government part, but there's this vision part, because that's not something that we do here in Los Angeles, is figure out how to tie everybody together.
It's always a danger, if you look at me.
Should I go on?
Actually, that is, I'm sure, one of the underlying things about your interest in the river is because it, I don't know how many miles it goes altogether, but the watershed is vast.
58.
How many?
58.
Thank you, Tom.
Hate guys like
There's always some nerd.
58.4.
Let me raise another question. I don't want to.
Let me just, one quick thing I want to talk about Dan's stuff is that, Dan's on the right trail here. Dan's doing this mixed-use development on transportation corridors. And, that should seem like a no-brainer that, let me see, we're going to have 3 million extra people in the next, 12 to 14 years. Where are they going to go? And how do we link them up? Let me guess, multifamily housing on mass transit corridors. I don't think that's a big stretch. And yet, I swear it's like he's designing a spaceship, because everybody's sort of like, how do you do these things? It's like, and I think that architects need to be engaged in that conversation, because this is how it's going to happen. If you look at Manhattan, look at every great city in the world, look at actually the beginning of LA. It all starts with transportation. It all begins that way. LA and why it is the way it is because Henry Huntington had a rail line that he needed to, get out into the country so they could sell real estate and make developments. And that's essentially where every single town we know in Los Angeles is essentially a railroad station for Henry Huntington, because he had a piece of real estate there. And we've got to rediscover that. And so ways of making that, I don't know, not so damn boring. You know what I mean? It's like, I think at some point we all have to look at this and say, do I want to live near the railroad tracks? And come up with a yes. Come up with a design plan that says, you know what, living near transit nodes is the best place to live. Because if all we're going to do is say, somebody will live there. Clearly not me, not him, not you, none of you guys, but somebody's going to live there. That's not a way to design.
If you look to your left, if you go to the east, there are two enormous sites, again, depending on how one defines a site. One is the railroad tracks,
right.
The railroad right-of-way,
yeah.
And it's conceivable a substantial building strategy and city planning idea could grow out of that or over that, and next to that you have the river. Part of the issue here is that pieces of infrastructure are done in a very simple or single-minded way. So the freeway is about the freeway, and the train is about the train, and the river is about the river, and then you go to the next subject. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're hypothesizing is that those pieces of infrastructure and those engineering designed uses could add very different kinds of uses, apparatus, design ideas, strategy. All of that is doable given the will to look out the window and see that it doesn't have to be tracks in perpetuity.
Just to add a little specifics to that, I think people don't realize how fast that's actually happening. If you just look at the red line of the MTA, and in fairness to them, when it was built, they purchased land around the sites, both for construction reasons, but also for the assumption that there would be major development. And then a recession hit, and there wasn't anything happening. But if you look at all the stops on the red line, something is underway or has happened. North Hollywood, major proposal that has both a high school and retail and lots of housing. Universal City, we could talk about that, but Hollywood and Highland.
Hollywood Western.
Is what, 1 million square feet. Hollywood and Vine is a proposals out. Dan, am I allowed to say you're beginning to work on Vermont and Wilshire, which is 7 acres?
Western, yeah.
Western,
Hollywood and Western is built, at least 2 corners of it.
Yep.
Two of the,
Wilshire and Western is Chris Pack.
well, if you just go down, and those of you who haven't seen what's going on, instead of always talking about, well, this is sometime in the future, you should realize some of it's built now and operating, and you can decide whether you think it's successful or not, but it's not all that far off.
Well, and there's a shift that's going on now. It has to happen significantly more, maybe even exponentially more, and that is the city itself has to get over, and is already getting over. And believe me, without being too sort of butt-kissing here, Jan Perry is one of the only council people in the history of the council that actually knows what the hell she's doing when it comes to planning, which is truly a miracle and a good thing for us, although it is blatant butt-kissing, I know. But nonetheless, one of the things the city has to learn how to do, and they are learning how to do it slowly but surely, is that we are, to some extent, subsidizing, well, of course we're subsidizing mass transit. We need to be subsidizing multifamily housing. We need to be subsidizing density. Some people might complain about that on some level and just say, oh, you're supporting developers and making them into billionaires. The fact of the matter is, this city, since its inception, has been subsidizing suburban development. The West Side is the West Side, not because everybody left them alone, but because everybody built highways to them, and everybody built an infrastructure that really was to the detriment of the rest of the city at large by dealing with a relatively affluent group of people who ended up on the West Side. And that's fine, nothing wrong with that, but it's time now to get into the center of the city and subsidize those intelligent strategies that need to be subsidized to assure that the next 50 years in Los Angeles are rational 50 years coming ahead of us.
Whoever said freeways are free?
Yeah, really, it's true.
I mean, you can't live in this city more than 30 minutes without realizing we need a subway line down Wilshire Boulevard to the beach, and down Ventura Boulevard to Warner Center, and out Whittier Boulevard, and it'd be nice to think that we as architects could, educate people or solve, create social justice, but what we do know about is infrastructure and buildings, and it seems to me that transportation has got to be something that we have the technology and the resources to accomplish in the city. It isn't that hard to do, and it ought to be number one, and I think in our political agenda.
I want to say again, and I think this is largely a student audience, that this is not a discussion that is a typical discussion that we hear at SCI-Arc. And I think for young students who will be young practitioners or listening again to those who are advocates of both this city as it stands and the city as it's coming to be, this is your audience, actually. This is the exchange that has to take place. These are the people that will be listening, and I think for me it's important to make the point to you so that we understand really the meaning and the purpose in educational sense for this discussion, at least in part. I wanted to raise or return to the 2 slides that I showed initially of very old cities drawn as ideals with centers, and to talk a little bit about the problem of center and centeredness and lack of center as it relates to a meaning in a city which transcends localities. So that if there is a point to which everyone goes, and a number of points where many people go, then the point where everyone goes is a defining point or an area that the city shares and gives it in a sense, a collective identity. So the question is, in a psychological city planning sense, does the development of a center or centers argue for the definition of a city which sees itself as a city, as an entity? And does the lack of a center lead to discussions like San Pedro and Hollywood and the San Fernando Valley, with a kind of dissolution, and dissolution relative to scale, so that something very big and cumbersome, which doesn't offer something unusual as a focus, should or could start to come apart and be replaced just by a number of operational pieces of a smaller scale. So there are a lot of parts to that, but maybe Jan,
I think that I don't think the problem is a lack of a center in a city like this, which is a basin city, and it's a horizontal city. There's a lack of a connection. I know that when I was driving out to Simi Valley last week to go to Ira's funeral, and I don't often get out that far because it's just too busy, but what struck me is the different topography out there, and yet we were still in Los Angeles. It looked like Arizona with the rock outcroppings, and the temperature was so different. And
And the coyotes.
And coyotes. But I think that, and the person I had in the car with me, we both agreed, and neither one of us supports secession, but we both agreed it's no wonder that people feel so disengaged out here. It's a whole different life out here. And so when I look at that, I think what is the opportunity that we have as planners or as people in the government or whatever, builders, developers, to pull them either our way or we go pull their way, go out there to go hiking or whatever. But what do we do? What do we offer them? And that's the real question. And what do we offer to San Pedro? What do we offer to, what's the last city before you cross over into Simi Valley? I don't even know. What is it? Is it Calabat? I don't know. Chatsworth, maybe?
Oh,
but what do we offer?
That's not a city, that's our neighborhood.
No, that's what neighborhood I mean, which neighborhood?
Yeah, actually Chatsworth.
Yeah, so I don't think a center would solve that because it's too large of a landmass to be able to define something that would cause most people to believe that that's the center of our city. I mean, with the opening of the new cathedral, you may find there are a lot of people now who believe that that's the center, whereas other people may believe that Century City is the center. I think it depends on who you're talking to.
I agree with Jan. I think that the discussion of kind of concentric circle and always talking about downtown as the center has probably been very off-putting to the rest of the region, because if you're not in the center, then somehow, where are you? And the reality is it's more of a crossroads and a matrix, and that's not in any way to denigrate the importance of downtown or its future. It's just a more, I think, realistic and inclusive way to describe the region. And those two photos you showed, basically these concentric historic cities, that would be probably, not only is it not reality in this region, but it would also be very unnerving to people who are in the outer circle.
This isn't, I wasn't making an argument, which I think is a position, either a SCI-Arc position or a personal position, and it's just a speculation, really. It has to do with thinking about where one lives. And understanding it, in a sense, as a definitive place, whether it's an association with water or buildings, cathedrals, music centers, government centers, or whatever it is. I think what to some extent you have, and this is not to say this is good or bad, but there are a number of components, and they're free-form components. They evolve, they get larger, they get smaller, they get more important, they get less important, they get connected, they get disconnected, they get reconnected, all of that. And this makes it, in a progressive and a contemporary sense, something which seems to continually reflect the moods of the people who live in it. But it also now starts to reflect the mood for dissolution. And the mood for dissolution seems to have something to do with how cumbersome the entity is and conceivably how unresponsive it is. So this is just a question about whether 3 areas and maybe others.
But I mean, I think to some extent, LA gets caught in that conversation about how special it is. You know what I mean? And on some level, I think we're a little too introspective with regard to that. I think if you look at what we would consider, you know, and there's an argument on every city, but I mean, if you consider New York a successful city, one way or another. I don't know. My guess is everybody here has visited New York in the last 3 to 5 years. How many of you have been to Staten Island? Yeah. How many of you have been to the Northern Bronx? How many have been to the Queens? How many have been to Brooklyn? You know, it is exactly as diverse as we are that way. I mean, if you talk to someone and go to Staten Island's a different country, you know, when you're in New York. It's not Manhattan. And for some reason, we've all sort of focused on the fact that Manhattan is the center. What do you
I don't know. My guess is most of the
But by the same token, even within Manhattan, though, talk to somebody in Chelsea.
Getting off at JFK are not heading for Queens.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I mean, if you look at someone who lives on the Lower East Side, has nothing to do with someone who lives on the Upper West Side. I mean, it is all about. It's not so concentric. It's not circle after circle after circle. It's really much more circles that have tangential relationships. I mean, it's really more about how dense are the circles in any given area, and what comprises the most dense portion. In the case of New York, it's Manhattan. In the case of Los Angeles, it is downtown. It has been a very fallow downtown for a very, very long time, but the infrastructure for all of those concentric circles exists just by the fact that right now we're downtown, but we're in the artist district downtown. You know, 6 blocks over, you'll be in the fashion district or the market area of downtown where the flower market is. You can be in the Old Bank district. You can be in. Notice how I got that in. You can be in the Civic Center. You can be. There are all these little concentric circles that exist here that make it more complex, and it's a little too easy sometimes to just go, oh, we're not like any other city. We're just so different. And you know what? We're not so damn different. We really are a different version of the same model, and now we've got to sort of find out how that model works at its best.
I think any of us, if we were starting from scratch, would design a different geographic governance structure. The city of Los Angeles, the city limits with their funny boundary and 4 million people and 485 square miles is too big to deal with neighborhood scale problems and too small to deal with regional problems like air quality or transportation or solid waste disposal, water quality. Those are metro scale problems, and we've inherited a city that grew out of its own sort of morphology and a county system from agricultural days, and part of our frustration, I think, in the Valley and the other neighborhoods' frustrations is that the city of LA is sort of trapped in a body of historical origin that is not tailored to the scale of the problems in a neighborhood or at a region. But back on your question of centrality, I think the city in the end is an economic animal. It really is an organism. It's a marketplace. And where there is only one source for a good or service such as SCI-Arc, I think that should be at the center. And the same holds true for government, for the concert hall, the sports arena, the football stadium, the other things of which there's only one. And those should be at the center, just logically, so they're equally accessible to everybody. And I think that's the economic role of downtown. It's not to compete with neighborhoods, which are wonderful, or regional centers, which are essential. People don't come downtown to buy shoes or movies. You buy those in your neighborhood. But people come downtown to see Phantom of the Opera, the Rolling Stones, and the Lakers.
So they should come back.
So
They should come down here to buy shoes.
Yeah.
you're taking the image and you're saying the image holds, but not in a literal way. You're saying the idea of unique events belongs to a conceptual center. It just doesn't have to be a literal concentric-based center, but there is an idea of weight or priority, or it exists once.
And it's also a question of access and the coming together of the disparate places from all over the region. And downtown does serve that purpose. It has the access. It's a place, as a lot of people have often said, it's a place where anyone of any ethnicity or race or income level can find some part of downtown they feel comfortable in, and it is a coming together. There are other places. The beach. I'm always, frankly, impressed that the beach is whether Venice Pier or fill in the blank, is really a place, a coming together place too. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a dense urban experience, but downtown does serve that purpose. And I think Dan's right. One of the kind of profoundly intelligent things about the location of, whether it be the cathedral or the convention center or the music center or the civic center, or it's funny how all the centers, but they are downtown, where it's accessible, where people from all throughout the region feel that it's their place as much as anyone else's.
But it was oddly empty until people started, well, you know what? I shouldn't say, I should correct myself. People have always lived downtown, but a broader mix of people are living downtown. And you could have added 2 Staples and 3 cathedrals and a partridge in a pear tree, and unless you get 100,000 people living downtown of various economic levels, then it will never be a real downtown. It will only be a place where people go, like they do now, and then get the hell out as fast as they can at 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock.
There was, I think, a very fundamental question when SCI-Arc moved, and the question was, would the students come with SCI-Arc? In other words, would students who had been in the suburbs, Santa Monica and the Marina, actually come downtown? And I think in many ways, SCI-Arc is a kind of prototype of this heterogeneous area. We met, the chairman of the board of SCI-Arc and myself met last week with 3 people from the R&D team of HUD. Did you know HUD had an R&D team? It hasn't been.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, but it wasn't actually so scary, except it was surprising. And what was unusual about the discussion, I don't think this has been shared so much with the student community, is that they were looking for areas in the city, in this city and in other cities, where experimentation might take place in terms of city strategizing. And when you look at SCI-Arc and you look at the tracks and you look at the river and you look at Bunker Hill and you look at County USC and you look at the freeways and you look at the site to the west, and you see it and you look at USC, I mean, there are all kinds of linkages and connections and possibilities, and it is truly a kind of remarkable microcosm of all of the forces that are pushing and pulling on the city. I think that makes SCI-Arc as an opportunity absolutely unique. I think that's why they came. What we'll do with them, we'll see.
Well, in cities throughout the country and probably throughout history, students and artists are used as the shock troops to start something, going. So it's just only a little scary that HUD is experimenting, but that's okay.
Those wild federales. No, but I mean, oddly enough, one of the great downtown issues that's going to come up, architecturally as well as planning-wise, is going to be the adjacent land to this very school, because this is an outpost now. What's happening next door to SCI-Arc is going to be an incredibly important thing. And actually, where is he? Ramon, there you are. The man who actually made SCI-Arc possible, the last guy there on the line, owns that land over there, and everyone now is engaged in a fascinating conversation about what happens next door. Everybody's got relatively common ideas in terms of use.
Don't let them leave the room.
Yeah, remote, I mean, in terms of having housing there and all sorts of things, but it's amazing how extraordinary the discussion's becoming, because SCI-Arc has inserted itself into a new neighborhood, has become a dynamic piece of that new neighborhood, has a vacant piece of land that now has to develop both with regard to its new use, SCI-Arc, and the existing neighborhood. And now what happens? Now you have 3 or 4 different constituencies who are now going to have a lot to talk about when it comes to this issue right next door, and SCI-Arc's going to play a large part in that. And it's fascinating because it's city growth, in work.
I'm happy to open it up. I think we've covered a number of issues that were important to you and important to me. If anyone in the audience would like to interrogate,
No,
this is your. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question regarding the corridors. Great commercial corridors all lead to downtown. Like in the rain, you saw. Washington, Venice, Olympic, and Beverly Third, and then from north to south, you got Western and Vermont, and Normandy. And I read recently that the city is considering altering zoning along those boulevards so that you can have mixed use on it. You have ground floor retail, and commercial, and you can put multi-family housing above that. So bring things about downtown. All roads really lead down. So if the panel could address the issue of development along those corridors, I'd be happy to hear what you have to say.
When they say zoning, they all turn to me, but first of all, let me correct you. All roads don't lead to downtown. There's a huge grid pattern over this whole basin, and several of those streets you mentioned don't lead to downtown. They, Vermont, Western, Normandy, and certainly if you're in the valley where there's a whole nother grid, also doesn't lead to downtown. Instead, I think as an urban form, you have to see the region as a center, as a series of centers, the biggest center being downtown, but also centers like Hollywood or San Pedro or Century City or fill in the blanks. But also then there's this incredible matrix of corridors, which sometimes links those centers and sometimes is just a grid over the basin. And when Tom was talking about the need to densify the city and the region, when you really think about it, what are the opportunities? What are the realistic opportunities, both in a market sense, a social sense, and in an urban form sense? And I think we have centers already that are dense, and ones like downtown will get more dense. We have quiet, low density, maybe sometimes not so quiet, but low density neighborhoods that are established and frankly aren't going to change. And I think, and this is where Jan, I'm sure feels strongly, the great strength of neighborhoods at all kinds of income levels is actually their stability. And this city is so filled with neighborhoods that have strong residential blocks, and then half a block away is a deteriorated or underutilized commercial corridor. And so I think the goal in the city becoming more dense is not to disrupt or destabilize neighborhoods at any income level which are healthy and functioning and people are living in and they're making their lives, but instead there's so many of these corridors, these commercial corridors that aren't functioning very well, aren't producing either jobs or taxes or homes or anything else. And I think that's what we're saying is a lot of those commercial corridors will have a better life and a better future for the neighborhoods through which they cross. Sometimes they're the seam of a neighborhood, sometimes they're the border of a neighborhood, but they would have a better role in the neighborhood's life and in the city's life if they were over time evolved into denser corridors of mix of uses.
There's also this thing with planning and zoning that may sound blasphemous right now, but in addition to directing new forms of growth, particularly in these corridors and corners and all that, there's also a really important thing that we need to take a look at, and that is prohibiting certain uses. And I know that's very difficult because you're doing something nobody likes. If you go to every bad neighborhood in town, go to every lousy corner in town, go to the one place that makes you feel the least good in Los Angeles, and I'll guarantee you something's happening on the corners. Any remnant of reasonable architecture that might have existed on those corners have been replaced by a gas station, a Pollo Loco, a Lucy's, whatever the hell it is, and all the corners will have been backed up for surface parking with some type of a fast food or a strip mall configuration happening at the corners. Go to a neighborhood that you like, and you will see the corners built up. You will see that the corners define the block, that they may deteriorate in the middle, but the corners are so exceptionally important, and yet 21st century marketing has now, and especially in Los Angeles, has now made it better to put your gas station, your El Pollo Loco, your McDonald's, and your Burger King all on these one corners, absolutely disintegrating that neighborhood, absolutely making it impossible for people to interact except through an automobile. And I think on some level, planning and zoning has to sort of come in and say, this neighborhood is about density, and by the way, you can't have a gas station on the corner. You've got to come to the street line. You have to do a street wall. You have to somehow express the density of the area.
Jan, maybe you could talk about Central Avenue, and since we're talking about corridors.
I was thinking about something that I did, which I've gotten a lot of flack for, which is asked the planning department to do a feasibility study on the possibility of doing a moratorium on fast food restaurants on Central Avenue, Vermont, and Broadway, because those are corridors that I really want to focus on. Central Avenue is a historic corridor, which I'd like to reinvigorate. I see Vermont as a corridor that really is ripe for pedestrian activity, and Broadway would be the one that would most lend itself to more big box retail activity. But throughout all of that would be my intent to create mixed-use projects. So again, bring more density to the commercial corridors, but also to leave the R1 or the single-family residential neighborhoods intact within those corridors, because they are sort of the heart and soul of what ties our city together. And while I did tie it to a fast food issue, what I'm really attempting to do is more of a land use, not a structure, but more of I guess some parameters, and then invite other kinds of activities and development into those areas instead, such as on Central Avenue, to see if I can attract a master developer to come and develop a number of parcels in more of a historic sense, the way it used to be, based on conversations I've had with people who've moved to Central Avenue in that area after World War II. And they talk about the reasons why they moved there, because it was a nice place to raise a family. It was a neighborhood in which you could walk and, go to the bakery, go buy shoes, walk home from church, things like that. And so I'm trying to, I guess, not only bring back the history, but then give it that modern aspect, which is to bring people to live on the commercial corridor as well.
Part of that discussion, as it relates to the property next door, also has to do with the question of parcelization and the subdivision of land. And as land is continuously divided, a strategy which is a larger strategy is more and more difficult to implement. So if you have a perspective or a point of view that concerns a large area, and you subdivide it into pieces, and each piece has to produce such and such green, such and such units, such and such parking, what you preclude is the possibility that, for instance, some of that land ought to be just green, and some of it ought to be just cars, and all of that. So part of the problem consistently is the inability, because of the way the city is structured, to look at problems at a bigger scale, and to make decisions that are overriding decisions that implicate past individual parcels. Anyway, anybody would take one more. Somebody else wants to? Yeah.
First, a comment. Talk about the corners. Well, when I was a kid, everything happened on the corner. Now that you do have all these fast food restaurants on the corners, all the activities went to the middle of the blocks to the parks. More criminal because of that. In the corner, we would say, we would do everything would happen on that corner, good, bad, or indifferent. That was the meeting point, and it kept everything away from the houses, and the kids played at the park, and people respected that. You went to the corner had a specific purpose in all of the communities, not just the black community. But I think from the developer's point of view, to make this downtown thing work, and even from the people that are going to buy these $400,000 lots that you want to sell, you got to figure out a way to get the people here. My man made a comment and said, well, we got to have approximately 100,000 people. Right now, the way they city has set up 100,000 cars going out and make it down there. There's nobody that's going to pay $3,000 a month, and it takes an hour to get home. I mean, it's just not going to happen. What I would like to see happen is something that they have in Detroit, would they have like a people, or maybe in San Diego, where they have the trolley that just basically runs from San Diego Stadium to right, just a couple of blocks. If we could just do something like that, but I think we're just beating around the bush talking about any type of development without some alternative transportation road.
Actually, the Gold Line is under construction within walking distance of this building. So, I mean, it's not all way off. And maybe you should show them your people mover.
What's that? My personal vehicle here, I just brought it. I just bought it like 2.5 hours ago. It's all electric and it's only $250. I swear to God, it's unbelievable. It's a great little thing. Although totally impractical, implus you live here in downtown. But I mean, transportation's key here, and I think that unfortunately politics is such a large part of this conversation. You can do whatever you want to in terms of architecture. I can do whatever I want to do in terms of development, but there's a political discussion going on and a discussion that's happening in the media that makes this all much more difficult, because people, somebody will say that the best way to move people around is buses. What we need is more buses, more buses. To hell with surface rail, more buses. Well, that's not true. And then somebody says, we need more rail, to hell with the buses. And different constituencies want you to do different things, and the game is balance. The game is, how do you balance transportation needs? How do you make bus and surface rail and subway work in a rational way? How do you make multifamily housing, single-family housing work in a rational way? How do you make commercial development and residential development work in a rational way? It's about balance, and unfortunately that doesn't always suit the sort of the political needs of different constituents throughout citywide.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. Gilmore, Con Howe. You want to listen? You want to take a few more questions?
I gotta take my dog.